In the slums of New Terra, 17-year-old Taiho Park knelt among piles of discarded machinery, his nimble fingers working to reconnect frayed wires inside a communications unit. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he focused intensely on the delicate work. The cramped room he called home was filled with salvaged technology parts he had collected from the nearby spaceport's trash heaps. "Come on, work this time," he muttered, connecting the final circuit. The device hummed to life, its screen glowing with a soft blue light. Taiho allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. This repair would earn him enough credits for food for the next week. Life had been hard since his parents died 5 years ago in a factory accident. With no relatives to take him in, Taiho had learned to survive on his own. His natural talent for fixing things became his lifeline in the slums of New Terra, the youngest and poorest of Earth's colony worlds. Outside his window, the twin moons cast long shadows across the narrow street. The spaceport loomed in the distance, enormous ships from across the galaxy regularly docking and departing. Taiho often watched those ships, wondering about the worlds beyond New Terra, places he knew he would never see. A loud knock on his door startled him. Visitors were rare, and rarely brought good news. Cautiously, he slid the repaired comm unit under a dirty cloth and grabbed a metal pipe he kept for protection before approaching the door. "Who's there?" he called out. "Imperial enforcement. Open the door immediately," commanded a stern voice. Taiho's heart raced. Imperial officers never ventured into the slums unless something was seriously wrong. Had someone accused him of stealing tech? He considered escaping through the window, but that would only make things worse if he was caught. With trembling hands, he opened the door to find 3 tall figures in the gleaming white and gold uniforms of the Arcturus Empire. Their perfect posture and emotionless faces marked them immediately as non-human. The Arcturians were known for their height, pale blue skin, and rigorously logical minds. "Are you Taiho Park, born 17 standard years ago, to Jin and Mina Park?" asked the central officer, glancing at a datapad. "Yes," Taiho answered, his mouth suddenly dry. "Did I do something wrong?" The officer ignored his question. "Your genetic profile has been matched in the Imperial database. You are hereby summoned to fulfill Interstellar Treaty Code 347B, the Marriage Compatibility Act." Taiho blinked in confusion. "Marriage? What are you talking about?" The second officer stepped forward. "Your DNA shows a 99.8% compatibility match with Crown Princess Era of the Arcturus Royal House. According to the treaty signed between our peoples 43 years ago, compatible individuals are legally bound to fulfill a marriage contract when such a match is discovered." Taiho laughed nervously, certain this was some kind of mistake or cruel joke. "Look, I'm just a repair tech. I don't know anything about any treaty or princess. You must have the wrong person." "There is no mistake," said the third officer, producing an official-looking document with the Imperial seal. The genetic scan was repeated 3 times for verification. "You will come with us immediately to prepare for transport to the Imperial Palace." The reality of the situation began to sink in. Taiho had vaguely heard of marriage contracts between humans and Arcturians, but they were rare and usually involved wealthy or politically connected families who volunteered their children, not orphans from the slums. "You can't just take me," Taiho protested, backing away. "I have rights as a citizen of New Terra." "Your human government signed this treaty," the first officer stated coldly. "The needs of galactic peace supersede individual preference. You have 30 minutes to gather essential belongings. Transportation to the Imperial flagship awaits." Taiho's mind raced for a way out. Could he run? Hide somewhere in the slums where they couldn't find him? But the Arcturians were known for their thoroughness and advanced tracking technology, and refusing would likely be considered a criminal offense. "What happens if I say no?" he asked. The officers exchanged glances. "Refusal would constitute a breach of the treaty," explained the second officer. "Such an action could destabilize relations between our species. Additionally, your government would be required to pay substantial penalties, which would likely be passed on to you. Taiho sat heavily on his worn chair, trying to process everything. So I'm being forced to marry someone I've never met because of some treaty I didn't sign. Your participation was predetermined by genetic compatibility. Princess Era likewise has no choice in the matter. The treaty serves a greater purpose than individual desires. With shaking hands, Taiho began gathering his few possessions, some clothes, his repair tools, and a small holophoto of his parents. The officers watched him passively as he stuffed everything into a tattered bag. Outside, a sleek Imperial shuttle had landed in the narrow street, drawing curious and fearful looks from neighbors. Some recognized the Imperial uniforms and hurried back into their homes, while others whispered and pointed. As Taiho approached the shuttle, his elderly neighbor Mrs. Kim rushed forward. "Taiho, what's happening? Where are they taking you?" she asked, eyeing the officers with suspicion. "Apparently, I'm getting married," he replied, trying to sound braver than he felt. "To an Arcturian princess." Mrs. Kim's eyes widened. "The compatibility contracts. But those are for the elite families, not slum orphans." Taiho finished with a bitter smile. "Seems my DNA disagreed." The shuttle door slid open, revealing a luxurious interior unlike anything Taiho had ever seen. Before boarding, he took one last look at the only home he'd known. The crowded buildings, the familiar faces, the life he was being forced to leave behind. As the shuttle doors closed, Taiho watched New Terra shrink beneath him until the slums were just tiny specks. Ahead, through the viewport, he could see the massive Imperial flagship hanging in orbit, waiting to carry him to a life he never asked for, to marry a princess he'd never met, in an empire he knew nothing about. His life as he knew it was over. What awaited him among the stars was completely unknown. Taiho stared through the viewport as the Imperial flagship grew larger. He had never seen anything so massive. The enormous vessel stretched for kilometers, its gleaming surface reflecting the light of New Terra's sun. Inside his chest, his heart hammered wildly. "We will dock in 5 minutes," announced one of the officers. "You will be escorted to your preparation chambers." "Preparation chambers?" Taiho asked. "You cannot meet the royal court in your current state," the officer said, glancing at Taiho's worn clothes and dirty hands. "You require significant preparation." The shuttle docked with barely a tremor. When the doors slid open, Taiho was met by a group of attendants in matching gray uniforms. They bowed slightly and gestured for him to follow. The flagship's corridors were wide and tall, designed for the Arcturian's greater height. Everything was pristine white, with blue light strips running along the walls. Taiho felt out of place, a smudge of dirt on a clean surface. "This way, sir," said one attendant, leading him to a large room with multiple pools built into the floor. "You must be cleansed before meeting the princess." For the next hour, Taiho was scrubbed, washed, and groomed by silent attendants. They removed his clothes, treating them as if they were contaminated, and replaced them with soft, blue garments made from a material he had never felt before. His hair was cut, his nails trimmed, and strange-smelling oils were rubbed into his skin. "The princess will see you now," announced a tall Arcturian woman who had entered the room. Her pale blue skin seemed to shimmer under the lights, and her white hair was pulled back in a severe style. "I am Neri, chief advisor to Her Royal Highness. You will address the princess as Your Highness, and speak only when spoken to." Taiho nodded, trying to remember proper manners he had never been taught. "What exactly am I supposed to do?" he asked. Neri looked at him as if he were a particularly slow child. "You are to be evaluated by the princess. The genetic match is only the first requirement. She must determine if you can be suitable." "Suitable for what?" Taiho wanted to ask, but Neri had already turned, expecting him to follow. They walked through more corridors until they reached a massive door flanked by guards in ornate armor. "The human match," Neri announced, and the doors swung open. The throne room took Tahoe's breath away. The ceiling soared at least 30 meters high, with crystal chandeliers hanging down like frozen waterfalls. The walls were adorned with moving murals that shifted between scenes of space battles and strange landscapes. At the far end, on a raised platform, sat a single throne, and on it was Princess Era. She was not what Tahoe expected. Unlike the other Arcturians, whose faces remained expressionless, her features were sharp with obvious displeasure. Her skin was a deeper blue than the others, almost violet in the throne room's light. Her eyes, large and silver, fixed on him with obvious assessment. "This is the match?" she asked, her voice cool and musical. "He is smaller than I anticipated." Tahoe bristled despite his fear. "And you're bluer than I expected," he retorted before he could stop himself. A collective gasp went through the room. Nari stiffened beside him, and the guards' hands moved to their weapons. But to everyone's surprise, Princess Era's mouth curved slightly. "At least he has spirit," she said. "Approach, human." Tahoe walked forward, feeling the eyes of dozens of court members on him. When he reached the bottom of the platform, Era stood and descended the steps until they were face to face, or rather, face to chest, as she stood a head taller than him. "Do you understand why you are here?" she asked. "Your people said something about a marriage contract." "That our DNA is compatible," Tahoe answered, "but nobody has explained why that matters." Era studied him for a long moment. "The Arcturus Empire spans 3,000 systems. Our genetics have become limited over time. The royal bloodline especially suffers from this limitation. Your DNA contains elements that complement the royal line perfectly. This makes you valuable to the Empire's future." "So I'm just breeding stock?" Tahoe asked, anger overcoming his fear. The court gasped again. Era's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You are to be a royal consort, an honor beyond anything your kind could normally achieve," she said coldly. "Your life in the slums is over. Here, you will have wealth, power, and purpose." "I had purpose," Tahoe shot back. "Maybe not one that matters to you, but it was mine to choose." Era turned to address the court. "Leave us, all of you." After the room emptied, leaving only Tahoe and the princess, her posture relaxed slightly. "Listen carefully, human. I did not choose this any more than you did. But our empire faces challenges you cannot comprehend, and this marriage is necessary for reasons beyond mere genetics." "What reasons?" Tahoe asked. "Politics, stability, survival." Era walked to a large window that showed the stars beyond. "There are factions within the court that wish to end our alliance with Earth. Some even push for war. This marriage will silence them, at least temporarily." Tahoe struggled to process this information. "So this is about politics, not just DNA." "Everything royal is political," Era said with a hint of bitterness. "You will learn this quickly." A small drone floated into the room, hovering near Era's shoulder. She took a small device from it and handed it to Tahoe. "This will help you learn our language and customs. You have 2 weeks to prepare before the formal announcement of our engagement. I suggest you use the time wisely." As Tahoe took the device, his fingers brushed against hers. A small spark of static electricity jumped between them, making them both pull back in surprise. "One more thing," Era said as she turned to leave. "Some in this court will try to use you or harm you to advance their own positions. Trust no one, not even me." With that, she swept from the room, leaving Tahoe alone in the vast throne room, holding a small device that was supposed to teach him how to be something he never wanted to be, a prince consort in an alien empire that saw him as nothing more than a political tool and genetic resource. Outside the windows, New Terra was now just a small blue dot in the distance. His old life was already fading away as the flagship prepared to jump to hyperspace, carrying him toward an uncertain future among the stars. Tahoe moved silently through the dimly lit corridor of the royal palace, his footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floor. 2 weeks had passed since his arrival, and he had learned to navigate the massive Imperial flagship that served as the mobile palace for the Arcturus royal family. The language device Princess Era had given him rested behind his ear, translating Arcturian speech and helping him learn their complex language. Tonight, instead of sleeping in his luxurious but closely monitored quarters, Tai-Ho was following a hunch. During dinner, he had noticed two court officials, Minister Do and Commander Jin, exchanging looks when the marriage announcement was mentioned. Something about their body language had triggered his street instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive in New Terra's slums. He pressed his body against the wall as a guard patrol passed, holding his breath until they turned the corner. The royal wing was supposed to be off-limits to him until after the wedding, but the palace's ventilation system had design flaws he'd quickly discovered. Growing up fixing things had its advantages. Tai-Ho reached a small maintenance panel and carefully removed it, revealing a narrow passage through which he could hear voices coming from Minister Do's private chambers. "The human boy complicates everything," Do was saying, his voice tight with anger. "The marriage ceremony is in 3 days. Once it's complete, our plans will be much harder to execute. Can we not simply eliminate him?" asked Commander Jin. "Make it look like an accident. Humans are notoriously fragile." Tai-Ho's blood ran cold. He pressed closer to the opening, straining to hear more. "Too risky," replied a third voice he didn't recognize. "The princess watches him closely. Besides, his death would only delay things. They would find another match eventually." "Then we proceed as planned," said Do. "During the Unity Ball tomorrow night, we will strike. The princess will never reach the ceremony." Tai-Ho's heart pounded. They were planning to assassinate Princess Era. Despite her cold demeanor and the forced nature of their relationship, the thought of her being killed made his stomach twist. He had to warn her, but who could he trust? Era herself had warned him to trust no one. As he backed away from the vent, his elbow knocked against the metal wall. The sound, though small, echoed in the quiet corridor. What was that? Commander Jin's voice sharpened. "Check the hallway." Tai-Ho scrambled away from the vent and ducked into an alcove just as the door to Do's chambers slid open. He held his breath as footsteps approached, then passed his hiding spot. When they faded, he slipped away toward his own quarters, mind racing. The next morning, Tai-Ho tried repeatedly to get a private audience with the princess, but her schedule was packed with preparations for the Unity Ball. Every request was blocked by her advisors, including Nari, who regarded him with increasing suspicion. "The princess cannot be disturbed with trivial matters today," Nari told him coldly. "Whatever you need to say can wait until after the ball." But it couldn't wait. Tai-Ho paced his room, trying to think of a solution. Finally, he remembered something: the small repair drones that maintained the ship. As a tech specialist, he might be able to reprogram one. Sneaking into a maintenance bay, Tai-Ho quickly located a small drone and connected it to his datapad. His fingers flew over the screen as he bypassed security protocols and uploaded a simple message: "Danger at ball. Must speak privately. Trust no one. T." He programmed the drone to deliver the message directly to Era when she was alone. It was a risk. Tampering with Imperial technology was probably a serious crime, but lives were at stake. Hours later, as Tai-Ho was being fitted for his formal attire for the ball, his door slid open without announcement. Princess Era entered alone, dismissing his startled attendants with a wave of her hand. "Explain your message," she demanded once they were alone. "What danger?" Tai-Ho quickly related what he had overheard, watching her face for any reaction. To his surprise, she showed no shock, only a grim satisfaction. "I suspected as much," she said. "Minister Do has opposed the human alliance since its inception." She studied Tai-Ho with new interest. "How did you discover this plot?" "I'm good at fixing things," he said with a shrug. "That means I know how they break. Your ventilation system has gaps in its security design." For the first time, Era's lips curved into something close to a genuine smile. Perhaps there is more to you than compatible genetics, Taiho Park. She paced the room, thinking. We cannot cancel the ball without revealing that we know of their plan, and we cannot know who else besides Do and Jin is involved. So we set a trap, Taiho suggested. On the streets, when someone was after me, I'd make them think they had me cornered, then turn the tables. Era nodded slowly. A human approach might be unexpected enough to succeed. She stepped closer to him. This will be dangerous. You are not obligated to risk yourself for me or the Empire. Taiho met her gaze steadily. I'm not doing it for the Empire. I'm doing it because killing people is wrong, even blue princesses who force people into marriages. Era actually laughed, a sound Taiho hadn't heard before. Very well. Here is what we will do. That night, the Unity Ball proceeded as planned. The Grand Hall was filled with Arcturian nobility, all watching as Taiho and Princess Era performed the traditional first dance of Unity. Taiho's heart raced, not from the dance steps he'd hastily memorized, but from knowing what was coming. As the dance ended and Era prepared to give her address from the central platform, Taiho noticed Minister Do's signal to several guards positioned around the room. These weren't the regular royal guards. Their uniforms were slightly different, with red trim instead of gold. The moment Era stepped onto the platform, Taiho spotted a guard raising a small device. Acting instantly, he shoved Era aside just as a pulse of energy shot across the room. The crowd erupted in chaos as the false guards moved in. But they were met with unexpected resistance. At Era's command, hidden royal guards emerged from concealed positions. Minister Do's face contorted with rage as he realized his plot had been discovered. In the confusion, Commander Jin lunged toward Taiho with a blade. Drawing on years of street fighting, Taiho dodged and used Jin's momentum against him, sending the much larger Arcturian crashing into a table of ceremonial items. When the fighting ended, Do, Jin, and their conspirators were in custody. Era stood tall among her loyal guards, her gaze finding Taiho across the room. With a slight nod, she acknowledged what he had done. Later that night, as medics treated a cut on his arm, Era came to him privately. You saved my life, she said simply. You would have done the same, Taiho replied, wincing as the medic applied medication. Perhaps. Era dismissed the medic and sat beside him. Do has confessed. The conspiracy runs deeper than we thought. They opposed the human alliance because, she hesitated, because they feared the truth would be discovered. What truth? Era's silver eyes met his. That the Arcturian race is dying, Taiho. Genetic degradation is destroying us from within. Your DNA isn't just compatible, it contains elements that could save our species. She looked away. The marriage was never just political. It was biological necessity. Taiho sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the true weight of the contract that had changed his life forever. Taiho stood before the massive door of the Imperial Archives, flanked by two solemn guards who now treated him with newfound respect. Since he had helped stop the assassination attempt 3 days ago, his status had changed dramatically. No longer just the human genetic match, he was now the princess's chosen protector as well. You may enter, Consort Park, said the chief archivist, a tall Arcturian with pale yellow eyes. The princess has granted you full access. Taiho nodded and stepped through the doorway into a vast chamber filled with floating data crystals and holographic displays. The genetic crisis that Era had revealed to him had consumed his thoughts. If her people were truly dying, perhaps his skills at fixing broken things might be useful for more than just machines. I need information on Arcturian genetic history, Taiho told the archivist, and human DNA compatibility studies. The archivist's eyes widened slightly. Those are restricted files. But your clearance is sufficient. He gestured to a private study area. I will prepare the data. Hours later, Taiho's head swam with information. The Arcturians had been experiencing genetic degradation for centuries. Their advanced technology had hidden the symptoms, but each generation was born weaker than the last. Their reproductive rates had fallen steadily. Without intervention, the Imperial scientists predicted extinction within 5 generations. What surprised him most was the section on human DNA. According to the records, humans weren't just compatible by chance. There was evidence of ancient genetic engineering that linked both species. Notes in the margins of these files were marked Imperial Eyes only and referred to something called the origin truth. Taiho was so absorbed in his reading that he didn't notice Princess Era enter until she spoke. "Finding anything useful?" she asked, causing him to jump. "Your Highness," he said, standing quickly. "I didn't hear you come in. Please, when we are alone, just Era will do." She sat across from him, her silver eyes studying the data he had been reviewing. "You've found the historical records?" "Yes," Taiho replied. "But there are references to something called the origin truth that I can't access." Era was quiet for a long moment. "Walk with me," she finally said. They left the archives and traveled deep into the flagship, to a section Taiho had never seen before. The walls here were different, older, made of actual stone rather than the sleek metal of the rest of the ship. "This is the original vessel," Era explained as they walked. "The first ship that brought the Arcturian ancestors to this galaxy. The rest of the flagship was built around it over centuries." They entered a small chamber that hummed with energy. In the center stood a simple pedestal with a single data crystal, far more ancient than any Taiho had seen in the archives. "What you are about to learn is known only to the royal family," Era said. "It is the truth of our connection to humanity." She placed her hand on the crystal, and a holographic display sprang to life. The images showed ancient star maps, DNA sequences, and recordings of beings that looked similar to Arcturians, but with subtle differences. The narration was in an old dialect that Taiho's translator struggled with, but he understood enough. "Your people weren't always Arcturians," he said slowly as the truth dawned on him. "You were human once, or at least from the same original stock." Era nodded. "Over 20,000 years ago, a group of advanced humans left Earth during what your histories call the First Dark Age. They settled in the Arcturus system and used genetic modification to adapt to those worlds." "But why keep this secret?" Taiho asked. "Pride," Era answered simply. "By the time we re-encountered Earth humans, our civilization was far more advanced. The Imperial Council couldn't accept that we came from the same origins as what they considered a primitive species." Taiho's mind raced with the implications. "So the genetic degradation is the result of too much modification over too many generations." Era finished for him. "We engineered ourselves into an evolutionary dead end. The traits we eliminated as primitive turned out to be essential for long-term survival and adaptation." Taiho moved closer to the display, studying the DNA sequences with new understanding. "These markers here, they're the adaptability sequences that Arcturians engineered out, but humans still have." "Exactly," Era said, a hint of admiration in her voice. "Your natural ability to adapt, to think creatively, to change with your environment. These are what my people sacrificed for immediate advancement." Taiho thought about the repair techniques he had developed in the slums, making do with whatever materials he could find. That kind of adaptive thinking was second nature to him, but apparently revolutionary to the Arcturians. "I think I can help," he said suddenly. "Not just with my DNA for your children, but for your entire species." "How?" Era asked. "Your scientists are trying to fix the problem the Arcturian way, with precision and control. But what you need is the human approach. Adaptability. Flexibility." Taiho's hands moved excitedly as he explained. "Instead of trying to edit specific genes, you need a system that encourages natural adaptation again." He pulled up some of the genetic data he had been studying. "Look here, these dormant sequences in Arcturian DNA. They're still there, just switched off. If we could create a therapy that reactivates them gradually over generations. Era stared at him with new eyes. You understood all of this from just a few hours in the archives. Taiho shrugged. Fixing things is what I do. Whether it's a broken comm unit or broken DNA, the principle is the same. Understand the system, find what's not working, and make it adaptable again. For the first time, Era touched him voluntarily, placing her hand on his. This is why the match was so perfect. Not just compatible genetics, but compatible minds. Over the next days, Taiho worked with the Imperial genetic scientists, explaining his approach. At first, they resisted. His methods seemed chaotic and imprecise compared to their careful engineering. But when simulations showed his adaptive therapy had an 87% higher success rate than their techniques, even the most skeptical scientists were convinced. As the wedding day approached, Taiho found himself no longer thinking of ways to escape his fate. Instead, he was learning to see Era not as his captor but as a partner in saving her people. She, too, had changed, seeking his opinion on matters beyond genetics and listening to his ideas with genuine interest. One evening, as they stood on the observation deck watching the stars, Era spoke softly. When they first identified you as the match, I was resistant. A human from the slums seemed like the universe's cruel joke on our royal line. Taiho smiled wryly. I wasn't exactly thrilled either. And now? She asked, her silver eyes reflecting the starlight. Now I think maybe the universe knew what it was doing after all, he replied. Your people needed something broken to fix what was broken in them. Era's hand found his again. And this time, neither pulled away. Perhaps we both needed that. The grand ceremonial hall of the Imperial flagship glowed with soft blue light as thousands of Arcturians gathered for the royal wedding. Taiho stood before a mirror, barely recognizing himself in the formal attire of an Imperial consort. The deep blue uniform fit perfectly, embedded with subtle technology that adjusted to his every movement. 6 months ago, he had been fixing broken comm units in the slums of Nuterra. Today, he would marry a princess. Nervous? Asked Juan, the young Arcturian who had been assigned as his personal aide. In the weeks since the assassination attempt, they had developed something close to friendship. Terrified, Taiho admitted, adjusting his collar for the 10th time. I still don't know all the ceremonial words. You'll do fine, Juan assured him. The princess specifically simplified the ceremony for you. Besides, after saving her life, and potentially our entire species, a few mixed-up words won't matter. Taiho smiled at that. His genetic therapy program had moved from theory to reality with remarkable speed. The first treatments were already being tested on willing Arcturian volunteers. Early results showed promise. Dormant adaptation genes were reactivating, bringing subtle but important changes to their physiology. A soft chime indicated it was time. Taiho took a deep breath and followed Juan through corridors lined with watching Arcturians. Some still regarded him with suspicion or disdain, but many now bowed respectfully as he passed. Word of his contribution to the genetic crisis had spread throughout the empire. The ceremonial hall doors opened, revealing a massive space transformed for the occasion. The ceiling displayed a real-time view of space outside, stars gleaming against the darkness. The assembled crowd of Arcturian nobility stood in perfect rows, their pale blue faces turned toward him. At the far end, on a raised platform, stood Princess Era. She wore a gown that seemed to be made of living starlight, shifting and flowing around her tall form. Her silver eyes found his across the distance, and for a moment, everyone else disappeared. This was no longer a political arrangement or genetic necessity. Something had changed between them in these past weeks, something neither had expected. Taiho walked forward, focusing on not tripping over his own feet. The music played by unseen instruments filled the hall with sounds unlike anything he had heard on Nuterra. When he reached the platform, Era extended her hand. He took it, feeling the now familiar coolness of her skin. Ready, she whispered. As I'll ever be, he replied softly. The Imperial Efficient, an ancient Arcturian, with skin so pale it was almost white, stepped forward. Today we witness the union not just of two individuals, but of two bloodlines, two worlds, and two futures, he intoned. This marriage represents hope for the Empire in ways both seen and unseen. The ceremony proceeded with Tai-Ho repeating phrases in the Arcturian language. To his relief, he remembered most of them correctly. When they reached the exchange of genetic samples, the Arcturian equivalent of rings, Tai-Ho carefully placed a drop of his blood into a crystal vial, which Era then wore around her neck. She did the same, the vial with her blood now hanging against his chest. With this exchange, the union is sealed, announced the Efficient. What has been separated for 20,000 years is rejoined. May this union bring strength to the Empire and healing to our people. Applause filled the hall as Tai-Ho and Era turned to face the assembled crowd. For the first time, they were officially presented as Princess Era and Prince Consort Tai-Ho of the Arcturus Empire. The celebration that followed was a blur of introductions, congratulations, and diplomatic formalities. Delegations from dozens of worlds offered gifts and good wishes. To Tai-Ho's surprise, even a small human delegation from Mutera attended, bringing news from his old home. Mrs. Kim sends her congratulations, said the human ambassador with a smile. She says she always knew you were destined for great things, though marrying an alien princess wasn't exactly what she had in mind. Tai-Ho laughed, feeling a pang of homesickness mixed with affection for his old neighbor. Please tell her I'm doing well, and that I haven't forgotten where I came from. Later that night, when the celebrations finally ended, Tai-Ho and Era stood alone on the private observation deck of their new quarters. Below them, the curve of a beautiful blue-green planet shone in the light of twin suns. Our new home, Era said, gesturing to the planet. Arcturus Prime. The Imperial Council will convene there next week to discuss expanding the genetic therapy program empire-wide. It's beautiful, Tai-Ho said, then hesitated. But sometimes I still miss Nutera. The noise, the mess, even the struggle, it shaped who I am. Era studied him thoughtfully. You know, as Prince Consort, you have the right to establish cultural exchange programs. Perhaps we could create a technology development center focused on adaptability and repair, staffed by talented humans from the slums of Nutera. Tai-Ho turned to her in surprise. You would do that? We need more of your kind of thinking in the Empire, she said. And I want you to feel that this is truly your home now, not just a place you were brought to against your will. For the first time, Tai-Ho felt a real sense of purpose beyond just being Era's genetic match. I think I'd like that. A communication panel chimed softly. Your Highnesses, came Mary's voice. The Zoltar delegation has requested an audience regarding potential genetic compatibility testing for their species as well. It seems word of your solution has spread beyond our borders, Era said after acknowledging the message. Other species facing similar challenges now look to humanity, to you, for answers. Tai-Ho shook his head in wonder. From fixing broken comm units to fixing broken species, life takes strange turns. Do you regret it? Era asked, a rare hint of uncertainty in her voice. Being forced into this life. Tai-Ho thought about everything that had happened since the Imperial officers had appeared at his door 6 months ago. The fear, the anger, the confusion, but also the discovery, the purpose, and the unexpected connection he had formed with Era. No, he said honestly. Sometimes the best repairs come from parts you never expected to use. Era smiled, the expression now coming more naturally to her. A very human philosophy. And one your people are learning to appreciate, Tai-Ho replied, taking her hand as they looked out at their new world together. On the planet below, the first generation of Arcturians to receive his genetic therapy were already showing signs of increased adaptability. Future generations would be more resilient, more creative, more capable of facing the unknown challenges of the universe. And somewhere in the slums of Nutera, Other young minds were developing the adaptive skills that might someday change worlds. The orphan boy from the slums had become something no one could have predicted, not just a prince consort, but a bridge between worlds and a healer of species. As the flagship began its descent toward Arcturus Prime, Taiho realized he had finally found a broken thing that, once fixed, would matter not just for years, but for generations to come.